The mist rolled in quicker than I'd expected, but I didn't mind. I loved the fog, loved the way it muted everything, softened the edges of the world, made it all feel a little more mysterious. It was perfect for my project. Whispers of the Wild was going to be my best work yet. I could feel it after everything I'd been through in the past year. Hell, in the past month. This was the reset I needed. Just me, my camera, and the Smoky Mountains. No one to answer to, no one to lean on. Just the way I liked it. I hefted my backpack higher on my shoulders and adjusted my camera strap. The trail was rough, more overgrown than I'd expected, but that was part of the draw. The more remote the location, the better the shot. No tourists ruining the landscape with their neon jackets or loud conversations. Just untouched wilderness. But untouched wilderness had its downsides. My camera had been acting up since I'd arrived. I'd missed some great shots because of it. Fog rolling over the peaks, a hawk perched on a branch just feet away. But I told myself I didn't care. This trip wasn't about getting everything right. It was about getting away. I paused to catch my breath and set the camera down on a fallen log. The lens fogged up almost instantly in the damp air, and when I wiped it off with the corner of my jacket, I realized I'd smeared dirt across it. Typical. "Come on," I muttered, digging into my bag for a lens cloth. As I crouched there, rubbing at the stubborn streak of mud, I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was a woodpecker. There were plenty of them around these parts, but it didn't sound right. Too slow, too steady. Tap, pause. Tap, pause. I looked up, but the fog was thickening, swallowing the trees just a few yards ahead of me. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just a branch knocking against a tree in the wind. I wasn't scared of being out here alone. In fact, I preferred it. No one to distract me, no one to get in my head. Still, the silence that followed felt too quiet, like something was waiting. I shoved the lens cloth back into my pack and stood up, forcing myself to move on. I had a campsite to reach before dark, and I wasn't about to get spooked by a weird noise, at least not this early in the trip. The fog never really lifted by the time I reached the clearing where I planned to camp. It was so thick I could barely see 10 feet in any direction. I set up my tent quickly, more out of habit than anything else, though I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on me. I wasn't sure why. There was no one around, no animals scurrying through the underbrush, not even a bird call to break the stillness. I figured a good night's sleep would shake off the nerves. I was just tired. The last few months had been brutal. Breaking up with Paul, the constant fights before it, the way he made me feel like I couldn't do anything right. This trip was supposed to be my way of proving him wrong, proving to myself that I didn't need him, that I didn't need anyone. But the anxiety crept up on me anyway, a tight knot in my chest as I lay in my sleeping bag, staring up at the ceiling of my tent. Then there was that tapping again, faint and far off. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, just the wind, just the forest. But then it stopped abruptly, like someone had flipped a switch, and I heard something else, something worse, a whisper. It was so faint I could barely make it out, but it was there, threading through the fog outside. It didn't sound like words, not exactly, but it was too rhythmic to be wind, too deliberate. I sat up, listening hard, my heart racing. Nothing. I grabbed my flashlight, clicked it on, and aimed it through the thin walls of the tent. Just mist and shadows. The whispering stopped, but the silence that followed felt alive, thick with something I couldn't name. I switched off the light, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but deep down, I knew something wasn't right. The next morning, I packed up quickly. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I just wanted to get moving. The fog had lifted slightly, but the forest felt wrong somehow, like it was holding its breath. I didn't like it. I wanted to get to higher ground, get some better shots, and move on. By midday, I'd made it to a rocky ridge that overlooked a valley. It was beautiful, exactly the kind of shot I'd come for. The fog clung to the trees below, creating a sea of white with the mountain peaks poking through like islands. I snapped a few photos, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. When I reviewed the pictures on my camera, my breath caught in my throat. There were figures in the fog. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, just shadows cast by the trees. But the more I zoomed in, the clearer they became. Tall, thin shapes, barely visible, but definitely there. Human or something like it, standing motionless among the trees, watching me. I whipped my head around, scanning the valley below. There was no one, just mist and trees. But in the photos, the figures were there. I lowered the camera, heart pounding. I hadn't imagined it. I couldn't have. And yet the air around me felt suddenly cold. Not the kind of cold that comes with a change in the weather. This was different, deeper, like it had seeped into my bones. I should have left right then, packed up, and headed back to the main trail. But I didn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was keeping me here, pulling me deeper into the wilderness. That night, I camped by a small stream. I hadn't seen any more figures, but the unease clung to me like a second skin. I felt like I was being watched constantly. Every time I looked over my shoulder, there was nothing there, but the feeling wouldn't go away. I built a fire, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to distract myself by reviewing the day's photos. That's when I noticed something else. The figures in the fog weren't in just one picture. They were in all of them. Some barely visible, others clearer, standing in groups or alone. Always watching, always there. My hands started shaking, and I nearly dropped the camera. It was impossible. I'd been out there for hours, and I hadn't seen anyone. Not a single hiker, no animals, no birds, but there they were in every shot. Suddenly, the whispering started again. It was louder this time, closer. I stood up, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The beam of light cut through the mist, but I couldn't see anything. Still, the whispering grew louder, like it was circling me, coming from all directions at once. "You shouldn't be here." That's what it sounded like, a woman's voice, soft but firm, blending with the rustling leaves and flowing water. It wasn't clear, not exactly, but the meaning was clear. I wasn't welcome. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed toward the tent. The whispering followed me, growing sharper, angrier. My flashlight flickered, and for a brief second, I saw her. She stood at the edge of the trees, tall and thin, dressed in old, ragged clothes. Her face was pale, hollow-eyed, and filled with sorrow. She didn't move. She just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Then, just as quickly as she appeared, she was gone. The flashlight flickered back to life, and the whispering stopped. I didn't sleep that night. By the time dawn broke, I knew I had to leave. This wasn't some trick of the mind. No matter how much I'd tried to rationalize it, there was something in these woods, something angry, and I had trespassed. I packed up my gear in record time and set off toward the trailhead. But the forest seemed different now, like the trees were closing in on me. The path I'd taken to get here was gone, swallowed by the fog. My compass spun wildly, useless, and the map was no help in the unmarked wilderness. Panic gnawed at my insides as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to keep my bearings. But the more I walked, the more lost I became. And all the while, I could feel her watching, waiting. The whispering started again as I crossed a small clearing, louder this time, angrier. I dropped my pack, desperate, and spun around. There she was, standing in the mist, her eyes locked on mine. I fell to my knees, breath coming in ragged gasps. "I'm sorry," I whispered, though my voice was barely audible over the growing wind. I didn't mean to. Her expression softened just slightly, and for the first time I felt something other than fear. She wasn't just angry, she was in pain. "I'm sorry," I repeated, louder this time. "I shouldn't be here. I didn't know." The wind died down, the whispering faded, and slowly the figure in the mist began to dissolve, melting back into the fog. I sat there for what felt like hours, heart racing, too afraid to move. But she was gone. The air felt lighter, the forest less oppressive. When I finally stood, I saw it. Small, barely visible in the fog, a stone hidden among the trees. A grave, long forgotten, buried deep in the wilderness. I didn't touch it. I didn't even get close. I just stood there for a moment, paying my respects to the spirit I'd disturbed. Then, without looking back, I turned and walked away. I made it out of the Smokies that day, but the images, the figures in the fog, the woman's sorrowful eyes, followed me. I never published the photos from that trip. Some things I realized weren't meant to be captured. Some things were meant to be left alone. The road wound through the dense trees, snaking deeper into the heart of the Lowell National Forest. The thick canopy above allowed only sparse sunlight to filter through, casting shadows across the narrow dirt road. I gripped the steering wheel of my RV, trying to shake off the gnawing sense of unease creeping up my spine. It had been 3 hours since I'd passed another vehicle. Solitude was the whole point, wasn't it? This trip was supposed to help me clear my head, to reconnect with myself after the divorce. I had spent the last few months in a fog, and this trip to Deadwood Creek was meant to be my escape. A test of independence. No ex-husband, no stress, just me in the wilderness. I needed this. At least that's what I'd been telling myself for the past 2 weeks. Deadwood Creek Campground wasn't listed on any mainstream maps, just a blip on an obscure site for hardcore campers who sought isolation. The campground had a reputation, but that was part of the appeal. I needed remote quiet, far away from anything that reminded me of what I'd left behind. But as I pulled into the clearing, past the sign half buried in moss that read Deadwood Creek, a shiver ran through me. The place was eerily quiet. The kind of silence that makes you second-guess your decision to be alone. I parked the RV near a small trickling creek. The only other vehicle was an old, beat-up camper a short distance away, nestled under the towering pines. It was empty. No sign of movement, no campfire. Good. I wasn't in the mood for socializing. I stepped out into the cool afternoon air and surveyed the site. The woods were thick, ancient. The ground was littered with pine needles, muffling the sound of my footsteps, a perfect retreat. I set up camp, unfolding my chair and setting my mug of tea beside me as I sat by the creek, listening to the soft gurgle of the water. It was peaceful, just as I'd hoped. But after a while, the peace felt off, too still. The air grew heavy, pressing down on me, and the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was oppressive. My mind wandered back to the stories I'd read online, the rumors about Deadwood Creek's dark history. This used to be a mining settlement during the gold rush, or so the tale went. Dozens of men had come to find their fortunes, but most found only death. Mysterious disappearances, bodies never recovered. Some say the men still haunt the place, bound to the land, working their endless shifts beneath the earth. I dismissed it at first, chalking it up to local folklore meant to spook tourists. But now, sitting alone in the fading light, the stories didn't seem so far-fetched. The wind rustled the trees, and I jumped at the sound. Get it together, Hannah, I thought, rolling my eyes at my own nerves. I hadn't come all this way just to scare myself into leaving. That's when I saw him, a man standing near the edge of the campground, just at the tree line, leaning against a tree. He was tall with broad shoulders and a scruffy beard, his clothes worn and dirty as if he'd been out here for weeks. His gaze was fixed on me. I waved awkwardly, and he lifted a hand in response before slowly walking over. "Didn't mean to spook you," he said, his voice easy, almost too casual. "Didn't expect anyone else out here this late in the season." "I wasn't expecting anyone either," I replied, forcing a smile. "Just needed some time alone, you know?" "Yeah, I get that," he chuckled, though the sound didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'm Rick, by the way. Been coming here for years." I nodded, unsure what to say. Rick had the look of someone who belonged out here, who knew the woods like the back of his hand. I didn't. "Be careful out here," Rick said after a pause, his gaze drifting toward the woods. "Deadwood Creek's got a history. Strange things happen when the sun goes down." My skin prickled at his words, but I forced myself to laugh. "Let me guess, ghost stories? Miners and all that?" Rick's expression didn't change. "Something like that. Just don't stray too far from your camp." He turned and walked back to his camper without another word, leaving me with a knot of unease in my stomach. That night, I couldn't sleep. The RV was quiet, the temperature inside dropping faster than I expected. I wrapped myself in blankets and tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong. Then the sound started. At first, I thought it was the wind, but soon I realized it was more than that. Faint at first, barely perceptible. A rhythmic clinking echoed from the direction of the creek. It sounded like tools, mining tools, pickaxes striking rock. I bolted upright in bed, my heart pounding. No, I was just imagining it. This was what I came here for, solitude. But I couldn't shake the sound. It was getting louder, the metallic rhythm persistent, almost like a heartbeat. I grabbed a flashlight and climbed out of the RV, my breath visible in the cold night air. The forest was a wall of darkness, the trees looming overhead like silent sentinels. The sound of the creek was louder now, rushing over rocks, and I could swear I heard voices, whispers carried on the wind. My flashlight beam swept across the campsite, catching nothing but trees and the faint shimmer of water. But then I saw them. Figures, shadowy, half-formed shapes moving by the creek, their outlines faint but unmistakably human. They moved like they were working, digging, swinging pickaxes in time with the clinking sound. My throat tightened as I realized they weren't there in the normal sense. They were translucent, faded. I stumbled back, my mind scrambling to make sense of it. Ghosts? No, that was impossible. I backed toward the RV, my pulse racing, but as I turned, I nearly collided with Rick. "Easy," he said, raising his hands. "I saw your light. Thought I'd come check on you." I couldn't find the words to explain what I'd just seen. But Rick didn't need me to. He just looked over at the creek and nodded, his face unreadable. "They come out at night. The miners. Been here for over a century, trapped in their own hell." I swallowed hard, trying to suppress the rising panic. "You mean you know about this? What is this place?" Rick gave a half smile, though it was more sad than comforting. "Deadwood Creek. These men came here to find gold, but all they found was death. Now they're stuck here, working the land forever. Some nights, they're just echoes. Other nights," he trailed off, but the implication was clear. On other nights, they weren't just echoes. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, enjoying the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite, deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life. Birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique one I'd brought along to mess around with during my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing, until now. I stood up from the fire, walking over to the RV and ducking inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it, a voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. Maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing, I was sure. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong, like the message wasn't for just anyone, like it was for me. I shut the radio off, my fingers trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, the towering pines looming overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1378. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, made me uneasy. I stepped back outside, trying to push the growing sense of unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. I heard it too. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal. The numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer. His voice was low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals, glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 137. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes were constantly scanning the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask more, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft, rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. Then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" he whispered. I could barely whisper back, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "We see you." The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical. "We see you." I stood up, flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note, just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles, the battery draining faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 137. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected, an old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device, pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, all crashed into me at once in an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower, as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, as if something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV. The lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper. Even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror, it didn't stop. And I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am, and it's not done with me yet. I never wanted to drive Loveland Pass again. I hadn't been back on that stretch of road since the night Marty died, the night his rig went over the edge and disappeared into the fog, like it had never existed. The only thing they found was twisted metal at the bottom of the canyon. I told myself it wasn't my fault, but the guilt stuck to me like oil on a rag, refusing to wash off no matter how many miles I put between me and that place. But Pete called in a favor. He needed me, and I owed him more than I could count. A convoy job through the Rockies, 3 trucks hauling high-value cargo to a research facility in Colorado. It was big money, but more than that, it was for Pete. He convinced me with a laugh over the phone. "Come on, Red, we need your experience out here. What could go wrong?" I didn't laugh, not this time. So there I was, back in the driver's seat of my rig, with Pete leading the convoy, and another trucker, Jerry, bringing up the rear. The snow-capped peaks of the Rockies loomed ahead as we started our ascent through Loveland Pass. The winding road snaked around the mountains, a narrow, dangerous route where one wrong move could send you tumbling into nothingness. The memories hit hard as soon as we passed the first switchback, the same stretch where Marty had lost control. I gripped the wheel tighter, feeling the familiar weight of regret in my chest. I'd spent years avoiding convoys, always driving solo. The ghosts from that night hadn't let me forget, and now I was back, like I was inviting them to haunt me all over again. "Red, you still with us?" Pete's voice crackled over the CB, cutting through my thoughts. I pressed the mic. "Yeah, still here. Roads are getting slick. We should take it slow." Pete agreed, and we settled into the grind, navigating the treacherous turns with caution. The sun had set hours ago, and now only the thin beams of our headlights cut through the growing darkness. The fog rolled in thick and fast, curling around the edges of the road like ghostly fingers. That's when I saw it up ahead. Just barely visible through the fog was a pair of headlights. They flickered like a dying flame, appearing and disappearing in the swirling mist. I squinted, leaning forward, trying to get a better look. It was a truck, no doubt about it. But there was something familiar about the way it moved, the way it hugged the curves of the road like it had been driving this route for years. I keyed the mic again. "Pete, you see that truck up ahead?" Silence. Then Pete's voice came through, confused. "There's no truck, Red. Just us." I glanced in the mirror. Jerry's headlights were still behind me, steady and unchanging. But the truck in front? It wasn't one of ours. I let go of the mic, my gut tightening. Maybe it was a local driver, someone familiar with the area. But as I watched it more closely, I knew that wasn't right. The truck was old, real old, the kind of rig you didn't see much on the road anymore. And then it hit me, hard and fast. The paint job, the faded red stripe down the side, the same color as the one Marty had on his rig. My chest tightened. "No," I whispered, gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles went white. It couldn't be Marty's truck. It was gone, destroyed, crumpled at the bottom of a canyon. But this was his rig. It had to be. The headlights flickered again, and then the truck was gone, swallowed by the fog like it had never been there. "Red, you good back there?" Pete's voice crackled through again. I didn't respond right away. My pulse was racing, my hands slick with sweat. I glanced around, looking for any sign of the truck, but the road was empty. "Yeah," I said finally, my voice shaky. "Just seeing things." But I wasn't seeing things. Not this time. We kept moving, the road winding higher, the fog thickening. The curves grew sharper, and the guardrails seemed to disappear into the mist, making it feel like we were driving on the edge of the world. That's when the CB crackled again. But this time, it wasn't Pete or Jerry's voice. "Red, you gotta help me." The voice was faint, distorted, but I recognized it immediately. My heart stopped. "Marty?" I whispered, disbelief creeping into my voice. The radio stayed silent for a moment, but then it came again, clearer this time, like the words were being dragged through the static. "Red, help me. I can't hold on." I dropped the mic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. Marty was dead, gone. But that voice, it was his. Down to the rasp he always had when he called me Red. I hadn't heard it in years, and yet here it was, crackling through the radio like a ghost from the past. I tried to shake it off, tried to convince myself it was just some weird interference. But the road ahead seemed to twist and shift unnaturally, like the mountains themselves were trying to trap us in. I checked my mirrors again, half expecting to see the ghost truck reappear. But there was nothing, just the thick swirling fog. "Pete, something's not right," I said into the mic, trying to keep my voice steady. "We should stop, let the fog clear." "Negative, Red. We've got a tight schedule. Keep moving." His response was sharp, almost panicked. Pete wasn't the type to scare easily, but I could hear the tension in his voice. He knew something was wrong too, but he didn't want to say it. The fog pressed in closer, and suddenly the road didn't feel familiar anymore. I'd driven this pass more times than I could count, but now it was like the route had changed. The turns were sharper, the drops steeper. I didn't know where we were headed anymore. And then I saw the truck again. It appeared out of the fog, closer this time, swerving wildly across the road. The old rusted cab. The faded red stripe. It was Marty's rig, no doubt about it. But when I pulled alongside, there was no driver. The cab was empty, the windows fogged over from the inside. My stomach lurched. I slammed the brakes, swerving to avoid the ghost truck, but it vanished into the mist as quickly as it had come. My truck fishtailed, tires screeching against the wet pavement, but I managed to hold it steady. My heart was pounding in my chest. "Red, what the hell's going on back there?" Pete's voice snapped through the radio. "I saw him," I muttered, barely able to catch my breath. "I saw Marty's truck." Silence hung in the air for a long moment. I knew Pete was processing what I'd said, trying to figure out if I was losing it, or if there was something more. But before he could respond, the CB crackled again. Marty didn't make it. It wasn't Pete. It wasn't Jerry. It was Marty. His voice filled the cab clearer than before, as if he was sitting right next to me. "You let me go, Red. You let me fall." I clenched the wheel, anger and fear boiling in my chest. "I didn't let you fall. I tried, Marty. You didn't try hard enough." The road twisted again, sharper this time, and I could barely see the guardrail through the fog. But I kept driving, adrenaline coursing through me as Marty's voice echoed in my head. Suddenly, Pete's voice cut through the chaos. "Red, you gotta snap out of it. This isn't real." "It's the mountains messing with you," I snapped back. "Messing with me. Don't act like you don't hear him, Pete. Pete didn't answer. The road ahead dipped sharply, and I saw it, the same curve where Marty had gone over, the same stretch of road where his truck had disappeared into the canyon. My heart raced, my mind spinning. Was that where this was leading? Was I about to relive Marty's crash? "Marty, I'm sorry," I whispered, gripping the wheel tighter as the road curved dangerously toward the edge. "I'm so damn sorry." The fog lifted just enough for me to see what was ahead. Marty's truck in the middle of the road, blocking the pass. There was no time to stop, no time to think. I swerved hard, avoiding the ghost truck at the last second. My rig skidded, the wheels screeching as I fought to keep control. For a moment, I thought I was going over the edge. The wheels teetered on the lip of the canyon, the guardrail creaking under the weight of the truck. But I yanked the wheel, pulling the rig back onto solid ground. My breath came in ragged gasps. I looked in the rearview mirror. The ghost truck was gone. The fog was clearing, and for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. "Red?" Pete's voice came over the radio, softer now. "You still with us?" "Yeah," I whispered, gripping the wheel with trembling hands. "I'm still here." The mountains stretched ahead, empty and quiet. But I could still hear Marty's voice in the back of my mind, and I knew, in some way, he'd always be with me. We made it through the pass just as the sun broke over the horizon, casting a pale light over the jagged peaks. The road ahead was clear, but I knew I'd never forget the night I'd faced Marty's ghost. We thought we knew the Ozarks. Matt swore up and down that Mark Twain National Forest was a hidden gem, untouched trails, beautiful vistas, perfect for a 3-day backpacking trip. He was always good at selling these kinds of trips, making it seem like a dream adventure. I believed him mostly because I loved him. But even then, as we parked the car at the trailhead and unloaded our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that this trip was going to be different. "Looks like we're in for some real wilderness this time," Kyle said, flashing a grin. He was already making jokes about getting lost and being eaten by cryptids. Classic Kyle, always trying to lighten the mood. I laughed it off, but something about the dense trees and the isolation made the joke sit heavy in my chest. The forest felt too quiet, too vast. Matt, as usual, was all business. He was adjusting his pack, double-checking the map on his phone. "We'll follow the GPS for most of the way," he said, his voice filled with confidence. "Should be easy. Just a couple of tough climbs, but nothing we can't handle." I glanced at Sarah, who was tightening the straps on her hiking boots. She was always the tough one, competitive, never backing down from a challenge. I liked that about her, but sometimes it felt like she had something to prove, especially when Matt was around. I couldn't tell if it was admiration or rivalry. "Let's get moving," Matt called, waving us on. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The first day went as expected. We hiked deeper into the forest, leaving behind the marked trails and venturing into the heart of the wilderness. The trees were taller here, their branches heavy with green, creating a canopy that let in only slivers of sunlight. It felt like the forest was swallowing us whole, but Matt pressed on, oblivious to the creeping unease that gnawed at me. That night, we set up camp by a small stream. The air was cooler than I expected, a bite of cold that sank into my bones as the sun set. Kyle's tent had a broken pole, something he hadn't noticed until we tried setting it up. He laughed it off, saying he'd just sleep in Sarah's tent. But Matt's frustration was clear. "Next time, check your gear before we leave," Matt snapped, his voice tight. "Relax, man, it's just a tent pole," Kyle said, but the tension between them simmered. I was too tired to deal with their bickering, so I busied myself with starting the fire. Dana, my girlfriend, snapped photos as always, capturing the last glimmers of daylight filtered through the trees. She looked peaceful behind the camera, but I could tell she felt it too. That sense that something was off. That night, we heard the first howl. It was distant at first, almost like the wind moving through the trees, but then it came again, low and deep, rising into a chilling wail that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "What the hell was that?" Sarah muttered, her hand instinctively moving toward the hatchet strapped to her pack. Matt shrugged, trying to play it off. Probably just a coyote or something. These woods are full of wildlife. But it didn't sound like any coyote I'd ever heard. I exchanged a glance with Dana, and she raised her eyebrows in that way she did when she didn't believe something. Kyle, of course, took the opportunity to joke. "Sounds like Bigfoot's out there, or maybe the Ozark howler," he said, his voice teasing. "You guys know that one, right? Big hairy creature, glowing red eyes, hunts hikers for fun." "Knock it off," Matt said sharply. "It's just an animal. Get some sleep. We've got a long hike tomorrow." I tried to brush it off too, but lying in our tent that night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig outside, made my heart race. I must have drifted off at some point, but it was restless sleep. The next morning, Dana told me she'd seen something outside the tent, just for a second, but she was sure of it. Red eyes. "I saw red eyes, Matt," she said softly. I laughed nervously, thinking she must have been half asleep. "Maybe it was just a trick of the light," I said, though even I didn't believe it. I hadn't told anyone about the dreams I'd had, the sensation of being watched, hunted, like we were intruding on something that didn't want us there. Day 2 was worse. The forest grew denser, the path less defined, and the GPS signal flickered in and out. At one point, we lost it completely. Matt insisted he could still navigate using the map, but the landscape wasn't matching up with anything. The trees felt wrong, closer somehow, like they were moving in on us. The air grew colder, and the silence pressed down like a weight. "We're lost," Sarah said flatly, glaring at Matt. "We're not lost," he snapped back. "I know where we are." But he didn't. None of us did. That night, we found claw marks on the trees, deep gouges like something had raked through the bark, with claws far larger than any animal should have. Dana's hands trembled as she took pictures, but Matt dismissed it. "Could be a bear," he said, though the unease in his voice was obvious. "That's not a bear," Kyle muttered, his earlier joking tone gone. He stared at the claw marks, his face pale. "This is messed up, man. Maybe we should turn back." "We're not turning back," Matt said, his voice rising. "We've come this far. We stick to the plan." The argument that followed was inevitable. Sarah sided with Kyle, saying we were unprepared and it wasn't worth the risk. Dana stayed quiet, but I could see the fear in her eyes. Matt, stubborn as ever, refused to admit we were in over our heads. We set up camp again that night, and the howling returned. This time it was closer, louder, the sound reverberating through the trees like something was circling us. I barely slept, and when I did, I dreamt of those red eyes watching us from the darkness. In the morning, we found more signs. Animal carcasses torn apart, strewn across the ground. Deer, mostly, their bodies mangled in ways that didn't make sense. No predator would kill like that. Not for food. It was like something had ripped them apart for fun. Kyle was the first to voice what we were all thinking. "It's the howler, man. I'm telling you, this place is messed up." Matt, as always, refused to believe it. "It's just a predator. Wolves, maybe." "There are no wolves in the Ozarks," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "Not anymore." We kept moving, but the howls followed us, louder, closer. By late afternoon, we knew we weren't alone. We were being hunted. It was just before dusk when we saw it. We stopped to rest, setting our packs down near a small clearing. That's when Dana froze, her camera slipping from her hands. "Matt," she whispered, "behind you." I turned just in time to see it step out of the trees, hulking, shadowy, with glowing red eyes that burned through the dim light. Its body was massive, covered in thick dark fur, but its shape was wrong, twisted like something caught between animal and something more. The howl that followed was like nothing I'd ever heard, a deep, guttural sound that shook me to my core. It didn't charge, it didn't attack, it just stood there, watching, as if daring us to move. We didn't. "What the hell is that?" Kyle's voice was barely a whisper, his face drained of color. "It's not real," Matt muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Dana grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my skin. "We have to go," she said, her voice trembling now. The creature tilted its head, almost curious, its red eyes glowing brighter. Then, with one last bone-chilling howl, it slipped back into the trees. We didn't wait to see if it would return. We packed up in record time and started moving fast. Too fast. The light was fading, and we were stumbling over roots and rocks, our breath coming in short, panicked gasps. That night, we didn't set up camp. We just kept walking, desperate to put distance between us and whatever that thing was. The howls continued. Closer, always closer. When dawn finally broke, we stumbled upon an old ranger's cabin. Its roof caved in, the windows shattered. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. We collapsed inside, too exhausted to keep going. For the first time in hours, the howling stopped. Matt stared at the floor, his face pale, his hands shaking. "It's not real," he whispered over and over again like a broken record. But we knew better. We had heard it, seen it. The Ozark howler was real, and it had let us live, for now. As we sat in that ruined cabin, the forest watching, waiting, I realized we hadn't escaped. Not really. The howler was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, and it was only a matter of time before it came back. I had been staring at the sinkhole for hours. The edges of the earth had crumbled away into a perfect jagged circle, leaving nothing but a gaping void beneath me. It was unnervingly symmetrical, as though the ground hadn't collapsed on its own, but had been carved out by something, or someone. I crouched at the edge, carefully adjusting my geological scanner, but the equipment was giving me nothing but static. The readings were all over the place. "This doesn't make sense," I muttered, tapping the scanner in frustration. I hadn't come all the way to Hollow Creek for faulty data. I took a deep breath and scanned the horizon. The thick pines loomed like sentinels around the campground, the pale light of late afternoon casting long shadows across the landscape. My RV sat parked a short distance away, looking small and vulnerable against the vast wilderness of Chugach National Forest. It was a beautiful place, no doubt. Quiet, remote, exactly what I needed to clear my head. But the silence had a weight to it, an unnatural stillness that gnawed at the edges of my mind. I was here on a solo trip, tasked with investigating the sudden appearance of several sinkholes that had been forming in the area. Geological instability was the theory, but something about the way these holes formed had raised red flags from the moment I arrived. The patterns were too precise, too deliberate. My phone buzzed, breaking the silence. It was Ethan, the local park ranger, and the closest thing to human contact I'd had in days. His voice crackled through the static as I picked up. "Hey, Megan, how's it going out there?" "Not great," I admitted. "The equipment's glitching again, and these sinkholes, I don't know. They feel weird. Not like anything I've seen before." Ethan chuckled, but there was an edge to it. "Hollow Creek's always been strange. You wouldn't be the first to think something's off here." "What do you mean?" I asked, standing up and dusting off my jeans. "You ever hear the stories about this place? Locals believe the sinkholes are more than just geological shifts. They think there's something ancient beneath the earth. The indigenous people used to call it the land that breathes. They thought the earth here was alive, that it could swallow you whole if you weren't careful." I rolled my eyes, though the words stirred an uneasy feeling deep in my gut. Sounds like folklore to me. "Maybe," Ethan said, his tone serious now. "But I'd be careful if I were you. These woods have a way of playing tricks on you. And the sinkholes, well, they've taken people before. People who didn't listen to the warnings." I didn't respond right away, staring down into the abyss of the sinkhole in front of me. I'd studied rocks and underground formations for most of my career, but nothing had prepared me for the unnerving stillness of this place. "Thanks for the heads up," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "But I'm here to study geology, not ghosts." Ethan sighed. "Just don't go deep, okay? Call if you need anything." I hung up and pocketed the phone, but the conversation lingered in my mind. The land that breathes. Superstition, I told myself. Just old stories. I turned back to the sinkhole. Something inside me itched to see what was beneath the surface, to understand what was causing the ground to shift in such a strange, unnatural way. The patterns in the rocks I had been studying weren't like any natural formation I'd seen before. There were spirals, perfectly etched into the stone, as though by design, not by nature. The deeper I looked, the more I felt like I was standing on the edge of something I wasn't meant to find. That night, the first signs of trouble came in the form of noise. A low, deep rumbling that vibrated through the ground like the hum of a giant unseen machine. It started just as I was finishing dinner, sitting by the campfire. The sounds blended into the whispering wind at first, but then it grew louder, more distinct, like a deep pulse coming from below. I stood, flashlight in hand, scanning the trees. The stars were barely visible, shrouded in the thick clouds that seemed to roll in out of nowhere. The fire flickered, casting eerie shadows on the trees. For a moment, I thought I heard footsteps, something moving in the dark. "Ethan?" I called, my voice small against the vast silence. Nothing. I walked toward the sinkhole, my stomach knotting with every step. The rumbling grew louder, and as I reached the edge, I felt it. Vibrations under my feet. The ground beneath me was shifting, alive. I shone my flashlight down into the hole, but the beam disappeared into the blackness, swallowed by the depths. I knelt, running my hand along the edge. The earth was soft, loose, as though it had only recently begun to settle after something had disturbed it. Suddenly, the ground beneath me gave way. I scrambled backward, heart racing, just as a section of the earth collapsed, sending a cascade of dirt and rocks into the sinkhole. I fell onto my back, gasping for air, watching as the hole grew wider, deeper, like a hungry mouth devouring the ground. Adrenaline pumped through me as I backed away, my mind racing. I needed to get out of here. This wasn't normal. This wasn't just a geological phenomenon. Something was moving beneath the surface. Something massive. I rushed back to the RV, the flashlight beam bouncing erratically as I fumbled for the key. But as I reached the door, the ground shook again, harder this time. The sinkhole was growing fast. I had to leave now. But then a thought struck me. What if I was right? What if this was something no one had ever discovered before? If I could just capture proof, if I could document what was really happening here, my work would be revolutionary. I would be vindicated. My mind flashed back to the spirals in the rock, the patterns that had seemed too deliberate to be natural. There was something ancient beneath the earth, and I was so close. I grabbed my gear and rushed back to the edge of the sinkhole. My heart pounded in my chest as I descended carefully into the darkness, lowering myself into the opening. The air grew colder as I went deeper. The walls of the hole were damp and slick beneath my hands. After what felt like an eternity, I reached the bottom. The cavern was vast, much larger than I had anticipated. My flashlight illuminated jagged rock formations, but it was the carvings on the walls that caught my breath. Symbols, spirals etched deep into the stone. They were everywhere, ancient and deliberate. This wasn't just a natural formation. This was a structure, a temple of some kind, buried deep beneath the earth for centuries, maybe longer. I pulled out my camera, hands trembling, and began to record. But as I did, a low, resonating sound filled the cavern. A rhythmic pulse like the beating of a massive heart. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, the ground shifting beneath my feet. And then, from the shadows, I heard it. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, coming from the deeper recesses of the cavern. Something was moving toward me, something massive. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the stone walls. I backed away slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. Whatever was in the darkness, it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, a weight in the air, a primal force that made my skin crawl. The footsteps stopped, and then a deep, guttural growl echoed through the cavern. I ran. I didn't look back. The ground trembled beneath me as I scrambled up the wall of the sinkhole, my hands slipping on the loose earth. The growling grew louder, closer, until I could feel hot breath on the back of my neck. I burst out of the sinkhole, gasping for air, and ran toward the RV. The ground shook violently, and as I reached the door, I glanced back. The sinkhole was collapsing in on itself, the earth swallowing it whole. But for a split second, I saw something. Something massive, serpentine, rising from the depths before it disappeared into the darkness. I didn't wait. I threw open the door, started the engine, and sped away, leaving Hollow Creek behind me. By the time I reached the main road, my heart had finally begun to slow. I was alive. I had made it. But the images of that cavern, those symbols, haunted my mind. I had uncovered something ancient, something that wasn't meant to be found. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had disturbed something that should have stayed buried. Something that was still there, waiting beneath the earth. And I knew one thing for certain: I wouldn't be going back. It was still dark when I arrived at Devil's Tower. The silhouette of the monolith rose above the horizon like a jagged alien structure. The first light of dawn barely touched the sky, but the outline was unmistakable. This place had always felt otherworldly, as if it didn't belong to the same earth the rest of us walked on. I parked the RV in the farthest corner of the campground, away from the few other visitors scattered throughout the park. I wanted isolation. Needed it, actually, after months of losing myself in work and failing to fix my crumbling marriage. I thought this trip might offer me some clarity. If nothing else, I had my research to keep me focused. Legends of Devil's Tower had fascinated me for years, but one in particular always stuck out: the legend of the Watcher. Native tribes in the region spoke of a spirit that guarded the tower, a being that offered ancient knowledge to those who sought it, but demanded a steep price in return. As a history professor obsessed with ancient folklore, I couldn't resist the lure of that story. I had come to Wyoming to dig deeper into those legends, hoping to uncover something, anything, that might be hiding in the shadows of the tower. I stepped out of the RV, the crisp morning air biting at my skin. The towering spires of pine trees loomed around me, creating an unsettling sense of isolation. I unpacked my gear, set up camp, and grabbed my notebook. The plan was simple: hike around the base of the tower, take some notes, and maybe, just maybe, find something that would finally make all the pieces click. As I set out toward the trail that led to the tower, I passed an older man in a park ranger uniform, grizzled with deep lines etched into his face. His eyes were sharp, though, alert in a way that made me feel like he saw more than the average person. "Morning," he said, tipping his hat. "Morning," I replied, glancing briefly at his name tag. "Tom, you here for the sights or something else?" His tone was casual, but there was an edge to it. I hesitated. "Research, mostly. I'm looking into some of the old Native American stories about the tower." He nodded slowly, his gaze flicking toward Devil's Tower. "The Watcher, huh?" I stopped. I hadn't mentioned that specific legend. He chuckled softly. "Everyone comes looking for something, but you do well to leave the Watcher alone, son. Some things don't like being disturbed." I tried to brush off his warning with a nervous laugh. "You don't really believe that, do you, Tom?" He didn't smile. "Doesn't matter what I believe. Just be careful. People who go digging too deep around here sometimes find more than they bargain for." With that, he turned and walked back toward the ranger station, leaving me standing there with a pit forming in my stomach. I told myself it was just local superstition, the kind of thing park rangers said to spook tourists. But as I turned my eyes back to the tower, the weight of his words lingered. By midday, I was deep into my hike, circling the base of the tower, taking notes on the surrounding landscape. The towering rock formation loomed overhead, casting long shadows over the forest below. I felt dwarfed by it, like a child standing at the feet of a giant. That's when I noticed the eyes. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a glimmer of sunlight catching on something in the trees. But then I saw them again, faint, glowing orbs between the branches. They were high up, too high to be an animal, and they followed my every movement. I stopped walking, my heart pounding. The eyes didn't blink, didn't move, just hovered there, watching. I wanted to dismiss them as some kind of wildlife, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more behind them, something intelligent. Forcing myself to continue, I kept walking, occasionally glancing over my shoulder to see if the eyes were still there. They were always just far enough away to keep me wondering, but close enough that I could feel their presence. When I finally made it back to camp, The unease hadn't left me. I sat by the RV trying to write in my notebook, but my mind kept drifting back to the eyes in the trees, the way they'd followed me, never straying too far, but never coming closer either. The sun dipped below the horizon, casting the campground in shadow. The tower loomed in the distance, a dark silhouette against the purple sky. The fire I'd started crackled weakly, the flames flickering as if they too were uncertain about staying here. I tried to convince myself it was nothing. I was a rational man, after all, a professor, a skeptic. But as the night wore on, that skepticism started to feel more like denial. The wind rustled through the trees and the fire guttered low. Then, just as the last light of the day faded, I heard it, a whistle. It started softly, almost like the wind, but it was too distinct, too deliberate, a single, drawn-out note that drifted through the trees, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, scanning the darkness. The fire cast faint light around the camp. "Hello?" I called, though I wasn't sure what I expected to hear in return. The whistle came again, sharper this time, closer. I grabbed my flashlight and swung the beam into the trees, but there was nothing. No movement, just the oppressive stillness of the forest. The whistling stopped, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than before. I sat back down, but sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the RV, every rustle of the trees made me bolt upright, expecting to see those glowing eyes or hear that eerie whistle again. I told myself it was just my imagination, just nerves from being out here alone. But the uneasy feeling stuck with me, settling deep in my bones. The next day, I set out again, hoping to shake the paranoia that had settled over me. I hadn't gone far when I ran into Julie, a solo traveler I'd briefly noticed the day before. She was standing at the edge of the trail, staring up at Devil's Tower, a strange look on her face. "Beautiful, isn't it?" she said, as I approached, though her tone didn't match her words. There was something off about the way she spoke, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. "Yeah," I replied. "I've been hiking around, looking into the old legends. You know about the Watcher?" She turned to me, a slow smile spreading across her face. "The Watcher? You're looking for it?" I nodded, uneasy. "It's just research." Julie's smile widened, but it didn't reach her eyes. "The Watcher doesn't like to be found. You know, it watches, but it doesn't want to be seen." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words stuck in my throat. Something about her was wrong. She seemed too calm, too knowing. The way she stared at me made my skin crawl. Before I could say anything else, she turned and walked back toward her campsite, leaving me standing there, heart pounding for reasons I couldn't explain. That night, the whistling returned, louder this time, persistent. I sat by the fire, gripping my flashlight, eyes darting between the trees. The whistle circled the campsite, moving closer then farther away, like it was testing me, toying with me. Then, just beyond the flickering light of the fire, I saw him. A figure, tall and gaunt, standing at the edge of the woods. His face was pale, hollow-eyed, and his mouth was pursed as the tuneless whistle drifted from his lips. My throat tightened. "Who are you?" I asked. The figure didn't answer. He just stood there, whistling that same eerie note. My chest tightened with a sudden surge of panic. I stumbled back toward the RV, tripping over a rock and falling to the ground. When I looked up, he was gone. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me. The sound of my breath was too loud in the confined space. The next morning, I found footprints around the campsite. Small indentations in the dirt, leading in circles around the fire. They hadn't been there before. On the final night, I couldn't take it anymore. The dreams of Devil's Tower had become unbearable, nightmares of the stone pulsing, breathing like a living thing. I dreamt of eyes, hundreds of them, watching me from the shadows, always watching. I had to go to the tower. I had to see it up close. I grabbed my gear and set out under the cover of darkness, the whistle guiding me, pulling me toward the monolith. The trees seemed to close in around me as I walked, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The stars above twisted and shifted, unfamiliar constellations blinking in and out of existence. As I neared the base of the tower, I saw her again. Julie, standing at the foot of the rock, her face pale and her smile too wide. "The Watcher is waiting," she whispered. "It's always been waiting." The whistle grew louder, piercing through my thoughts, driving me forward. I reached the tower, my hands trembling as I touched the cold stone. And then, out of the shadows, the Watcher appeared. It was a massive shadowy figure, its body indistinguishable from the darkness, but its eyes, glowing, burning orbs that stared into me, through me. It didn't speak with words, but its presence filled my mind, offering me ancient knowledge, secrets of the tower, of the universe, of myself. But the price. I could feel it gnawing at the edges of my sanity. The more I listened, the more I realized that accepting its offer would mean losing everything. My mind, my soul, everything that made me, me. I stumbled back, tearing myself away from the Watcher's gaze. The whistle reached a fever pitch, and I ran. The ground beneath me shifted and warped as the world collapsed around me. I barely made it back to the RV. When I crossed the threshold, the whistling stopped. The forest fell silent. I drove away as the first light of dawn touched the sky. The image of the Watcher's eyes burned into my mind. I knew I would never be the same. I stared at them, my breath catching in my throat. They looked like the handprints of a child, no more than a few inches across, and they were slowly, gradually melting away in the cold. A prickling sensation crawled up the back of my neck. I turned to look at the lights, now hovering at the edge of the forest. Close enough that I could make out their eerie bluish glow. They flickered in the trees, moving in slow, lazy circles, as if they were watching me, waiting for me. The rational part of my mind screamed that it was impossible. There was no way the lights could have traveled that fast. No way they could be this close. I'd seen videos, read reports. They were always distant, spectral, unreachable. But now they felt personal, as if they were beckoning me. I swallowed, my throat tight. Without thinking, I took a step forward. The cold deepened, pressing in on me from all sides. The frost crept up the sides of the RV, spreading like delicate veins. The temperature continued to drop. My breath came out in ragged gasps, and my vision blurred. The lights drifted deeper into the trees, flickering and glowing, moving in a pattern that felt deliberate, like they wanted me to follow. And I did. I grabbed my flashlight, my hands trembling as I made my way toward the forest's edge. The beam of light was weak, barely cutting through the dark. I kept my eyes on the lights, feeling a strange pull in my chest, like something was urging me forward. As I entered the trees, the world grew darker. The lights danced just out of reach, always a few steps ahead of me, their glow casting an ethereal light on the twisted branches. The forest felt wrong, too quiet, too still. I checked my watch. 2 hours had passed. I hadn't even noticed. My legs ached, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I had no idea how far I'd wandered. The lights flickered again, brightening as they circled a large boulder ahead, and then they stopped, hovering there, motionless. I took a step closer, and that's when the hallucinations began. Shapes, faint figures moving in the trees, shadows stretching unnaturally long. And there, between the branches, I saw faces. Pale, expressionless faces staring at me with hollow eyes. I blinked, and they were gone. Panic set in. I turned to leave, but the forest had shifted. The path I'd taken was no longer clear. Everything looked the same trees, the same twisting branches. The lights pulsed behind me, glowing brighter as if taunting me. I ran. My breath came in short, sharp bursts. My heart raced in my chest as I stumbled through the underbrush, trying to find my way back to the campsite. The lights flickered at the corners of my vision, but I ignored them. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Light, quick footsteps crunching through the frost behind me. I didn't dare look back. I ran faster, my flashlight flickering and dying in my hand. I broke through the tree line, gasping for air, and saw the RV ahead, a welcome sight. But the air around it was colder than ever. The frost was so thick on the windows that it looked like snow. And there, pressed against the glass, were more handprints, dozens of them. I scrambled inside, locking the door behind me, and collapsed on the floor, panting. My entire body trembled with cold and fear. The lights were still out there. I could see them through the frosted windows, flickering in the trees, growing fainter as the night wore on. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. By dawn, they were gone. The temperature returned to normal and the frost melted away, but I didn't feel safe. Not anymore. I packed up the RV and drove out of Pisgah National Forest, my hands still shaking on the steering wheel. I'd come here to find an explanation, to debunk the Brown Mountain lights. But what I found was something else, something I couldn't explain. And I knew, deep down, that the lights weren't just a phenomenon. They were something more. Something ancient. Something dangerous. Something that had almost taken me. I don't know what they wanted, but I'll never go back to find out. It had been 4 months since the divorce was finalized, and I was still trying to wrap my head around it. The life I had imagined, the woman I thought I would grow old with, it was all gone. That's why I decided to take the RV out to Mount Hood National Forest for a long weekend. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no reminders, just me and nature. My therapist said it would be good for me to clear my head and reconnect with something that didn't remind me of failure. Honestly, I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try something. If I stayed home, I would have just drowned myself in the silence of my empty apartment. This trip, I told myself, would be different. I could handle the quiet out here. I arrived in the late afternoon, pulling the RV into a spot near Timothy Lake. It was a beautiful area. Tall Douglas firs surrounded the lake like silent sentinels, the water reflecting the sky like a mirror. There were no other campers nearby, which was exactly what I wanted. Solitude. I parked, shut off the engine, and took a deep breath. The air was cool, crisp, with that faint scent of pine needles. Perfect. For a moment, I thought I could finally breathe again. After setting up a small campfire, I sat back in my foldable chair, staring at the fading light over the mountains. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Peace. That's what I needed. But as the sun dipped lower, the quiet became overwhelming. There was no wind now, no rustling, no animal sounds. Just me, sitting in a bubble of silence. I checked my watch. It was just after 6 p.m. That's when I noticed it. It was too quiet. The forest around me, which should have been alive with the sounds of birds and insects, was dead silent. At first, I figured it was just a lull, but as the minutes dragged on, the silence pressed down on me like a weight. I could hear the blood pumping in my ears, the soft crunch of every movement I made in my chair. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. I shrugged it off. Maybe this was what true isolation felt like. No noise, no distractions, just me and my thoughts. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement between the trees. It was subtle, a shadow slipping between the trunks, just far enough away that I couldn't get a good look. I froze, squinting into the woods. The firelight flickered, casting long shadows that played tricks on my mind. I scanned the tree line, waiting for the shadow to return, but saw nothing. The trees stood still, their branches unmoving in the dead air. Must be a deer, I muttered, forcing myself to relax. The wind picked up briefly, rustling the leaves. I sighed, relieved to hear some kind of noise again. I grabbed a few more logs and threw them onto the fire. The crackling wood was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't completely alone. I told myself I was just on edge from being out here, alone, with too much time to think. After eating a quick meal, I decided to call it an early night. The silence was getting under my skin, so I climbed into the RV, locked the door behind me, and settled into the small bed in the back. My phone had no signal, of course, but I wasn't planning on talking to anyone anyway. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to let my mind go blank, but the silence didn't let me rest. The RV was soundproofed, but even then I felt like something was missing. No crickets, no owls, nothing, just the absence of sound. I felt trapped inside my own head. Every little shift of the mattress or rustle of my blanket amplified in the quiet. Eventually, I drifted off. Sometime in the middle of the night, I woke up with a start. I wasn't sure why at first. There hadn't been any loud noises or nightmares, just silence. But something was wrong. My skin prickled with unease. I sat up, rubbing my eyes, and glanced around the RV. The windows were fogged up, and the air felt heavier, somehow oppressive. I heard something outside. No, that wasn't right. I heard nothing outside. I swung my legs out of bed and stood, listening closely. It was the strangest sensation, like my own breathing was distant, muffled, as though I wasn't entirely in my own body. I moved toward the window and wiped away some of the condensation with my sleeve, peering into the blackness beyond the RV. For a long time, I saw nothing, just trees and shadows, and then movement. This time, I was sure. A figure stood at the edge of the clearing, just barely visible in the moonlight. Tall, unnaturally still, like it was waiting for something. My heart leapt into my throat as I strained to see more clearly. It didn't move, just stood there watching. "Hello?" I called, my voice shaky. The figure didn't respond. I backed away from the window, heart pounding, my mind racing. Was it another camper? Some kind of ranger? No, there was no way anyone would be out here this late without a sound. I checked the door. It was still locked. Good. But I felt exposed, vulnerable, knowing that whatever was out there was watching me. I grabbed the flashlight and shined it out the window, sweeping the beam across the clearing. The figure was gone. Just like that. Vanished. As if it had never been there. The next morning, the forest was still eerily quiet. No birds, no animals, just the constant oppressive silence. I tried to shake off the unease from the night before, but it clung to me like a wet blanket. I told myself I was just paranoid, that the solitude was messing with my head, but something about the way the air felt today, something was off. I decided to take a short hike to clear my mind, hoping that getting out of the RV would make me feel better. But as I ventured down the trail, that feeling of being watched grew stronger. Every few minutes, I'd glance over my shoulder, expecting to see someone or something behind me, but the trail was empty. That's when I saw it again, a figure, this time in the distance, standing between the trees just off the trail. It was the same one from last night, tall, gaunt, and still. My heart hammered in my chest as I squinted, trying to make out more details. But before I could move, it slipped behind the trees and disappeared. I ran toward the spot where I'd seen it, my boots pounding against the damp earth. When I reached the trees, there was nothing. No footprints, no broken branches, nothing to show that anyone had been there at all. I stood there, catching my breath, feeling the silence pressing down on me like a vice. That's when I noticed something strange. The forest around me was completely still. Even my footsteps had stopped making noise. I stopped my boot on the ground, but I heard nothing, not even the crunch of leaves beneath my feet. Panic surged through me. I clapped my hands together. Nothing. No sound. My breathing was shallow, frantic, but it was like I was listening to it from far away. The world had gone completely, impossibly silent. And then I saw them. Not just one figure, but several, moving between the trees. Their bodies blended with the shadows. They were everywhere, circling me in complete silence. My heart raced, but I couldn't hear it. I couldn't hear anything. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, just that I needed to get away. My legs felt heavy, every step muted, like I was running underwater. The forest shifted around me, the trail disappearing into the thick fog that had rolled in, disorienting me further. Somehow I made it back to the RV. I slammed the door shut, locking it, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but still no sound. I grabbed my phone, hoping to call for help, but it was useless. The screen flickered, the GPS spinning in circles. I was trapped. For the next few hours, I stayed inside the RV, pacing back and forth, trying to calm myself down, but the silence never lifted. I couldn't even hear my own thoughts anymore. Just the crushing weight of nothingness. And then, as the light began to fade, I saw them again, the silent ones. They were standing in a circle around the RV, their faces blank, their eyes hollow. There were no features, no mouths, just smooth skin where their faces should have been. They stood perfectly still, watching me through the windows, their bodies unnervingly thin and elongated. I banged on the window, screaming, but of course, no sound came. They didn't flinch, didn't move. They just stared, waiting. Desperation clawed at me. I couldn't stay here. I needed to leave, but the RV wouldn't start. Every time I tried, the engine sputtered and died, as if something was draining the life out of it. I grabbed a flashlight and opened the door, stepping outside. The silent ones didn't move, didn't react. But as I walked toward them, the air grew colder, the silence even more oppressive. My footsteps made no sound. My breathing was barely there. I felt a hand on my shoulder and spun around, expecting to see one of them behind me. But there was nothing, just the fog swirling around me and the figures waiting in the distance. In that moment, I realized what they wanted. They weren't going to kill me. No, that would be too simple. They wanted me to join them, to become one of them. The silence wasn't just the absence of sound, it was a part of them, and it was seeping into me, stealing my voice, my thoughts, my very sense of self. And if I stayed here much longer, I knew I would lose everything. I don't remember how I made it out. The next thing I knew, I was driving far away from the campsite, from the silent ones. The sound of the engine, the tires on the road, it was all faint, like I was still caught in their grip. But at least there was something, a reminder that I hadn't completely disappeared into that silence. It's been weeks since I got back, but I can still feel it. The quiet follows me, lingers in the corners of my apartment. Sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night, I can feel their eyes on me, watching, waiting. And I know that one day, they'll come for me again. This time, I won't be able to run. My name is Jacob Johnson, and this happened back in 1996 out near the ragged coastline of Maine. I had this idea of finding some peace, so I borrowed my uncle's RV for the summer, thinking I'd get some fresh air, recharge from life. I figured I'd get in some solo time, a few fishing trips, some quiet nights. That's how I ended up at a park near Black Harbor, a little nowhere town that didn't even get cell reception back then. This wasn't a famous national park or even one of those scenic overlooks that people make pilgrimages to. It was just woods, rough and thick, fading into a rocky coastline that nobody seemed to care about. I was a few days into my quiet escape, living off canned beans on a half-empty propane stove that hissed with a little too much attitude for my taste. The most exciting part of my day was waiting for the rain to pass so I could take out my fishing rod. I didn't expect much more than sea salt air and seagulls. It was halfway through my fourth day, sometime in the late afternoon, that I heard what I figured must be kids from the local town messing around. The voices were faint, echoing through the woods in some distant way that made it hard to place them. I thought about walking down to see what was going on, maybe throwing a rock or two to scare them off if they got too close, but I didn't think much of it. By evening, though, something had shifted. I heard footsteps, not the quick, careless crunch of sneakers, but deliberate, slow steps. I was in the RV, scratching down a grocery list of things I'd need on my next trip back to town when I caught the sound. It was steady, creeping up around the corner of the RV. It hit me that I hadn't seen another soul out here since I'd arrived, and that didn't sit right. I mean, who comes out to this kind of place aside from someone with a taste for quiet or trouble? I kept still, waiting for the person to pass or show themselves, but there was only the slow, shuffling drag of footsteps. I tried to listen for the sound of multiple feet or voices, but it was dead silent except for that single shuffle. Against my better judgment, I opened the RV door and stepped outside. Nothing, just trees swaying in the evening light. But my instinct told me to keep quiet. I could still feel something out there, hiding, the kind of presence that prickles the hair on your neck and makes you regret stepping out of safety. I stayed there, scanning the tree line, listening. I almost thought I'd imagined it until I spotted something strange, half hidden between the trees, a figure, still as stone, facing away from me. The guy looked like he was part of the forest itself, cloaked in grime, with torn, mud-stained clothes hanging off him like a loose second skin. He didn't move. He didn't breathe. Just stood there, as if rooted to the ground. Now, I don't scare easy, but something about this man felt like a bad omen. I cleared my throat, thinking maybe he was some lost hiker or drifter, but he didn't flinch, didn't even look at me. Finally, I called out something casual, like asking if he needed directions. Still nothing. After a long moment, he turned, slow, like he was trying to remember how to move. His face was something I'll never forget, but not because it was scary exactly. It was hollow, if that makes any sense. This blank expression, like he'd forgotten what it meant to be human. He took a step forward, just one, like he was testing the ground. I backed up so fast I almost tripped. I tried to laugh it off, told myself he was just some messed up camper, but the way he looked at me, it was like he wasn't looking at me at all, just through me. I ducked back into the RV, my heart racing, and locked the door. It felt stupid, locking up, but something about him felt off, like he wasn't just some regular guy lost in the woods. I figured he'd wander off, but minutes later, I heard him shuffling again, this time closer to the RV. I looked out the window and saw him standing right there, not more than 10 feet away. His face twisted into this deadpan stare that sent a chill down my spine. Then came the whispering. Low, muttering sounds, barely audible, like he was talking to someone only he could hear. At first, I thought he was addressing me, but then I realized he wasn't looking at the RV at all. His head tilted, and he mumbled something about payment and lost souls. The words were scattered, fragmented, like someone trying to piece together a broken sentence. I sat there watching him, my heart pounding so loud I thought he'd hear it, but he just kept muttering, almost in a trance. At that point, I was just about ready to pack it up and find somewhere else to park. I reached for my bag, ready to throw some stuff together, when the RV suddenly rocked. I heard metal groaning, and something slammed into the side with a force that shook the whole rig. I was paralyzed for a second, gripping the edge of the table as the guy outside went silent. All I could hear was his breathing, loud and ragged against the thin walls of the RV. I heard a scratching sound, nails or something, scraping along the side, followed by a soft thud, as if he was testing the edges, feeling out the RV like it was some sort of animal he was trying to corner. I kept still, my back pressed against the wall, listening to every sound. I'd never felt fear like that. This primal kind of terror that kicks in when you realize you're trapped. The scratching stopped, and in the silence that followed, I heard the distinct sound of footsteps receding. I took a breath, thinking maybe he'd finally left, but then I smelled something foul. It was a metallic, rotten scent that crept through the vents, filling the air inside with a stench so bad it turned my stomach. I gagged, covering my nose, and nearly bolted for the door. Before I could, I heard him speak again. His voice was low and guttural this time. He muttered louder, "Must be paid." I froze, not sure if he was talking to himself or if he was giving some kind of twisted warning. Either way, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I grabbed my bag and edged toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to get out of there. I took a quick look through the window and saw him walking away, his figure disappearing into the trees. I bolted, taking off through the woods in the opposite direction. The sound of his footsteps echoed somewhere behind me, and for a moment, I thought I could hear him muttering again. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I'd cleared the tree line and hit the gravel road. My feet ached, and my lungs burned, but I didn't care. I just kept running, putting as much distance as I could between me and that place. Hours later, I found a small gas station by the highway and told the cashier everything. He gave me this look, like he'd heard it before, then mumbled something about an old man who'd gone crazy years ago, back when the town was still booming. He said the guy used to wander the woods, talking to himself about debts and payments, claiming to be some sort of collector. Local legend had it that he went mad after his family drowned in a storm. The story was that he'd gone feral, taking to the woods, driven by some twisted sense of revenge or justice. I don't know if I believe in all that. All I know is that I saw him, heard him, and every time I think of that muttering, debt must be paid, I feel a chill that doesn't fade. I don't know who he thought I was or what debt he imagined I owed, but I'll tell you one thing. I'm never setting foot near Black Harbor again. Some debts you just don't pay. When I left the city, I was desperate for peace. After a messy divorce and years spent staring at screens, I wanted silence. Real silence. Not the muffled hum of traffic or the constant buzz of electronics, but the quiet only nature could offer. That's how I ended up in Mohan State Park, alone in my old RV, parked on the edge of the Clear Fork Gorge. The park was stunning, especially in the late afternoon light. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their leaves a tapestry of green and gold. The air smelled clean, untouched by asphalt or fumes. It was perfect, at least at first. The first day was uneventful. I hiked the main trails, snapping a few photos with my phone, and spent the evening cooking a simple meal on my RV's small stove. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt a rare kind of contentment. This was what I needed. No emails, no ex-wife, no one telling me what to do or who to be. Just me in the woods. But by the second day, things began to feel off. It started when I noticed the trail. I had been walking back to my RV after a long hike when I spotted it. A faint path branching off the main one, almost hidden by overgrown bushes. It was narrow, barely more than a line of packed dirt, and it twisted sharply into the woods. Something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I was just tired of the predictability of the main trails. Whatever it was, I stepped off the beaten path and onto the faint trail. The air felt different as I walked, heavier, quieter. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, leaves rustling, seemed muted, as if the trees themselves were holding their breath. After a few minutes, I found the ruins. At first, I thought it was just a pile of rocks, but as I got closer, I saw the remains of a chimney and the rotting beams of what must have been a small cabin. A rusted metal lantern sat in the dirt, its handle broken. The ground was littered with shards of pottery and what looked like animal bones. A shiver crawled up my spine. Someone lived out here, I muttered to myself. The idea seemed impossible. This part of the park was miles from any road, and the trail was nearly invisible. Why would anyone build a cabin here? I snapped a photo and turned back toward the RV, eager to put the strange scene behind me. That night, the noises started. I had just crawled into bed when I heard it, a faint snapping sound, like someone stepping on a twig. I froze, my heart pounding. Raccoons, I told myself. Or maybe deer. I wasn't exactly deep in the wilderness, so wildlife was normal. Then came the footsteps, slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. They circled the RV, crunching the dry leaves and stopping occasionally, as if whoever or whatever was out there was listening. I grabbed my flashlight and swung open the door, shining the beam into the trees. "Hello?" I called, trying to sound more confident than I felt. "Is someone out there?" The forest stared back at me, silent and empty. After a few minutes, I retreated inside, locking the door and double-checking the windows. Eventually, the footsteps faded, and I convinced myself it was just a hiker passing through. Nothing to worry about. The next morning, I stopped by the visitor center to report the strange noises. Leah, the park guide on duty, greeted me with a friendly smile, but it faltered when I described what I'd heard. "You were near the old trapper's cabin, weren't you?" she asked, her voice low. I blinked. "Trapper's cabin?" she nodded. "It's an old story. Back in the early 1900s, a man built a cabin deep in the woods, far from anyone else. They say he was reclusive, didn't trust people. One day, he just vanished. No one knows what happened, but some locals think his ghost still wanders the forest." I couldn't help but laugh. "Ghosts? Come on." Leah shrugged. "Believe what you want, but I'd stay away from that area if I were you. People say the forest gets strange near the cabin." I left the visitor center feeling annoyed. Ghost stories were fine for campfire entertainment, but I wasn't about to let a local legend ruin my weekend. That night, the disturbances grew worse. I was halfway through dinner when the lights in the RV flickered and went out. I swore under my breath, grabbing a flashlight to check the breaker. As I fumbled with the panel, I heard the footsteps again. Closer this time, circling the RV like a predator sizing up its prey. The flashlight beam caught something on the ground. Footprints. Human footprints. Large and deep, as if whoever made them was heavy. My breath caught in my throat. "Okay," I muttered, trying to steady myself. "Someone's messing with me." Grabbing my hiking boots, I stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was out there. But the second I stepped into the clearing, the forest fell silent. No footsteps, no rustling leaves, just an oppressive stillness that pressed against my ears. That's when I saw the first figure. It was pale and thin, barely more than a shadow against the trees. It stood perfectly still, its face obscured by darkness. Then it moved, not toward me, but away, disappearing into the woods without a sound. I didn't follow. Instead, I locked myself in the RV, sat by the window, gripping a kitchen knife, and watched the forest until dawn. By the time the sun rose, I'd made up my mind. I had to go back to the cabin. I needed answers. The trail felt even more oppressive in the daylight. The air was thick, and the silence was absolute. When I reached the clearing, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. A small, rusted knife lying in the dirt. Next to it was a notebook, its cover warped with age. I picked it up carefully, flipping through the yellowed pages. Most of the writing was illegible, but a few sentences stood out, scrawled in jagged letters. It watches from the trees. Don't disturb the woods. The forest is alive. A chill ran down my spine. As I turned to leave, the ground beneath me seemed to shift, the dirt rippling like water. The trees creaked, their branches twisting unnaturally. And then I felt it. A presence. Something unseen, massive, and ancient. Watching me from every direction. I ran. The RV was my only sanctuary, but even there I wasn't safe. The lights flickered. The floor trembled. The air grew thick with the stench of damp earth. Through the window, I saw the pale figure again, joined by others, shadows slipping between the trees, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. The ground beneath the RV began to groan, roots writhing like snakes. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. It roared to life. I slammed my foot on the gas. As the RV lurched forward, the figures began to move, their blank faces turning toward me. The roots clawed at the tires, but the momentum was enough to break free. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest shrinking in my rearview mirror. I never went back to Mohan State Park. Whatever was in those woods, it didn't want me there. And I was more than happy to stay away. But sometimes, late at night, I dream of the forest. I hear footsteps outside my window, and I swear I can feel its eyes on me. The forest doesn't forget, and neither do I. My name is Noah Brown, and I'm 36 years old. This happened last fall when I decided to take my first solo RV trip to Spruce Knob Lake in West Virginia. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a way to escape the wreckage of my divorce and prove to myself that I could handle life on my own. I was tired of feeling like a failure, and this trip was my attempt at reclaiming some confidence. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. The forest doesn't care about your pride. I pulled into the campground late in the afternoon. The drive had been longer than expected, thanks to winding mountain roads and a temperamental GPS that insisted I make turns onto non-existent paths. Spruce Knob Lake lay in a valley, surrounded by dense forest, the kind of place that felt untouched by time. Before heading to the lake, I stopped at a small gas station on the edge of town to fill up and grab a few snacks. The attendant was an old woman with gray hair pinned in a tight bun. Her eyes had the kind of intensity that made you feel exposed. "Heading to Spruce Knob, huh?" she asked, her voice raspy. "Yeah," I said, forcing a smile. "A couple of days by the lake should be peaceful." Her expression darkened. "Don't go wandering the woods after dark, and if you see a lantern, you turn the other way." "A lantern?" I chuckled nervously, hoping to break the tension. "I'll keep that in mind." But as I drove away, her words lingered in my mind. By the time I reached the campground, the sun was dipping below the tree line. I parked the RV near the edge of the lake and set up a basic campsite. My gear was minimal: a rented stove, a secondhand flashlight, and a cheap folding chair that creaked every time I shifted my weight. It was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of silence that makes you hyper-aware of every small sound. The rustle of leaves, the soft lap of water against the shore, the occasional groan of the wind through the trees. Around 9 p.m., as I was reading by the dim glow of my lantern, I noticed something strange. A flickering light in the woods across the lake. It wasn't the steady beam of a flashlight or the glow of a campfire. It moved erratically, like an old oil lantern swaying in someone's hand. At first, I thought it might be another camper, but the more I watched, the more unsettling it became. The light moved deeper into the trees, then stopped, then blinked out. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But that night, as I tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. The next morning, I decided to explore one of the trails that looped around the lake. The air was crisp, the leaves a vibrant mix of red and gold, and for a while, I felt like I'd made the right choice coming here. About an hour into my hike, I heard it. Soft, rhythmic giggling. A child's laughter coming from somewhere ahead. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. No response. As I rounded a bend, I saw her, a little girl sitting on a rock by the trail. She looked about 10 years old, with dark hair and a pale face. She was wearing old-fashioned clothes, a long skirt and a cardigan that seemed out of place. "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping closer. She didn't answer. Her eyes stayed fixed on something in the distance. "Are you lost?" I tried again. She turned her head slightly, just enough to look at me out of the corner of her eye. Then she stood and walked into the forest without a word. "Wait," I called, hurrying after her. But when I reached the spot where she disappeared, there was no sign of her. Just a muddy child's shoe sitting on the ground. By the time I got back to the RV, the clouds had rolled in, turning the afternoon gray and heavy. I tried to push the encounter with the girl out of my mind, telling myself it was just a weird coincidence. Maybe she was a local kid playing in the woods. That night, things got worse. The electrical system in the RV started acting up. The lights flickered erratically, and the radio turned on by itself, blasting static. My flashlight died, even though I had just put in fresh batteries. I lit my lantern for some semblance of control, but the flame cast dancing shadows on the walls, making the RV feel smaller, more claustrophobic. Then came the sound of footsteps. They circled the RV, slow and deliberate. I peered out the window but saw nothing. Still, the sound continued, crunching leaves and snapping twigs just outside. I locked the door and sat on the bed, gripping a kitchen knife I'd brought for cooking. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment, the silence was almost worse. Then a voice broke the stillness. "Stephen," it said, a child's voice. Against every instinct, I opened the door. The forest beyond was shrouded in darkness, but there it was again, the flickering light. The lantern hovered at the edge of the woods, swaying gently as if beckoning me closer. And then I saw her, the little girl, standing beneath the light. "Help me," she whispered, her voice carrying through the still air. I stepped out of the RV. My legs moved almost against my will. The lantern retreated into the forest, and I followed. The girl's figure was always just out of reach. The trail grew steeper and more treacherous, the ground soft and uneven beneath my boots. The lantern led me to the edge of a ravine, its rocky walls plunging into darkness. At the bottom, I saw something glinting, a small mirror, cracked and streaked with dirt. The little girl stood beside it, her pale face illuminated by the lantern's eerie glow. "Jump," she said softly. "What?" I stammered, my voice trembling. "You have to jump," she repeated. Her voice wasn't pleading anymore. It was cold, commanding. I looked down at the ravine, at the jagged rocks below. The lantern hovered above the abyss, flickering like it was waiting for me to obey. Something in me snapped. "No," I said, my voice firm. The girl's face twisted into something monstrous. Her eyes darkened, and her mouth stretched into an unnatural grin. "You don't get to choose," she hissed, her voice no longer human. I reached into my bag and pulled out my journal, the one thing I'd brought to document my journey to rediscover myself. Without hesitation, I hurled it into the ravine. The lantern flared violently, its light pulsing like a heartbeat. The girl screamed, a sound that seemed to tear through the fabric of the night, and then she and the lantern vanished. I stumbled back to the RV, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The electrical system was working again, the lights steady, the radio silent. I packed up and left before the sun rose, driving until I was miles away from Spruce Knob Lake. A week later, I found something waiting for me in my apartment. Sitting on the kitchen counter was an old oil lantern, Its glass cracked and filled with ash. When I picked it up, I heard it, soft, rhythmic giggling, echoing from somewhere deep inside. I haven't camped since. The wilderness isn't always what it seems. Sometimes it's better to stay lost in the chaos of the city than risk finding what waits in the silence of the woods. My name is James Stevens, and this happened to me back in 2002 while camping in Mount Rainier National Park. I'd borrowed my cousin's RV for the first time. He said I was due for some real scenery therapy, as he called it, away from the stress and noise of the city. I had just wrapped up a divorce, and my mind was cluttered. Nature felt like a good reset button. I set up at Cougar Rock Campground, a secluded part of the park with tall pines and a stream that burbled quietly just out of sight. Peaceful, until the silence starts creeping up on you. The kind of silence that makes every sound, like a twig snapping or water trickling, seem 10 times louder. I parked the RV near the forest's edge, half a mile from the nearest camper, figuring the solitude would be good for me. Less human interaction, more time staring at clouds and mountains. Around mid-afternoon, I met another camper. His name was Russell, an older guy with a scraggly beard and a perpetual frown. He told me he'd been camping there for years, always alone. He said he liked the solitude, the natural rhythm of the place, whatever that meant. He had this rough way of talking, every word thick like he was chewing on gravel. Friendly enough, though, and I thought it was kind of nice to have a fellow loner around. We talked a bit about the area, and then he mentioned something about strange folks drifting into the park lately. People who didn't seem to belong, as he put it. I shrugged it off, but I did notice that Russell's campsite was a mess, with empty cans and old camping gear scattered around like he'd set up for the long haul. I got this off feeling, like he wasn't there just for the peace and quiet, but I brushed it off. He was just another stranger in the woods. No more, no less. By sundown, I was back at my RV, thinking a quick dinner of instant noodles would do just fine. I cranked up the little camping stove, ate in silence, then decided to go for a short walk by the water, flashlight in hand. The stream was a faint line of silver under the moonlight, but everything else had fallen into darkness. I'd taken just a few steps when I saw someone else on the trail. Not Russell. This guy was tall, with wild hair, clothes that were patched and frayed, and a scar that ran from his left cheek down to his neck. I gave him a nod, the casual, keep your distance nod people give in the wilderness. He didn't respond, just stared back, his eyes lingering a bit too long. I kept walking, but I could feel his gaze following me. It was like the guy was sizing me up. Back at my RV, I locked the door and made sure the windows were secure. I had just settled in to get some sleep when I heard footsteps. Light ones at first, like someone trying not to be heard. I thought maybe it was Russell. Maybe he'd had a bit too much of whatever he was drinking by the fire earlier. So I ignored it. But then the footsteps grew louder, then stopped, right by the side of the RV. A minute later, there was a light knock on the door. I froze, listening, my mind racing through who it could be. No one else was around. Not this late. I ignored it, hoping whoever it was would take the hint. But then came another knock, louder this time. I crept up to the small window by the door and peered out, just enough to catch a glimpse. It was the scarred man from earlier. He was standing there, his head tilted, a sick smile stretching his mouth like he'd found exactly what he was looking for. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to keep calm. I hadn't brought a gun, something I was seriously regretting at this point. But the guy hadn't seen me yet. Maybe he'd just leave if I stayed quiet. Then, in a voice just loud enough to cut through the walls, he said, "Hey, Brandon, I know you're in there." The blood drained from my face. How the hell did he know my name? I didn't remember mentioning it to anyone except Russell, and even then, it was in passing. My mind scrambled through every option. Stay silent? Open the door and try to talk him down? Grab something heavy and defend myself? I reached for a frying pan, the heaviest thing within arm's reach. Not exactly a weapon, but better than nothing. I crept toward the door, thinking maybe I could give him a hard enough swing to make him rethink his plans. But just as I was about to take a breath and steady myself, the guy pounded on the door. Hard. Enough force to shake the whole RV. "Brandon, open up. I'm not leaving until we talk," he said. His tone was calm, like he was asking for a cup of sugar instead of trying to break into my camper. Then I heard it. A scraping sound, like metal against metal. I looked down and saw a thin blade, maybe a pocket knife, slowly working its way through the RV door lock. A wave of panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could think of. I pushed against the door as hard as I could, holding it in place with my weight. The blade slipped, and I heard him curse under his breath. For a second, I thought maybe I'd scared him off. But then, the guy's face appeared in the window, eyeing me with a mix of annoyance and amusement. "You don't make this easy, do you?" he muttered. I must have looked terrified because he laughed, low and hollow. He tapped the window, pointing at me like I was a bug in a jar. That's when I caught the movement behind him, a dark figure moving out of the tree line, slowly, deliberately. Russell, he must have heard the noise and come over to check things out. Russell didn't say a word. He just stood there, watching. For a second, I thought he was going to help me, that he'd scare this guy off. But he didn't. He just watched. His face expressionless, as the guy kept trying to force his way in. I pounded on the window, yelling for Russell to help, to do something. But he stood there, unmoved. And then I realized, Russell was in on it. Suddenly, I was a trapped animal. The frying pan felt absurd in my hands, 2 against 1, and I was stuck inside a fiberglass cage. There was no way I'd make it if they got in. My only shot was to run. I dropped the pan, shoved open the emergency hatch in the roof, and scrambled up. The cold air bit against my face. I heard them both cursing below as I climbed, stumbling over myself in the darkness. I was barefoot, the sharp gravel digging into my feet as I ran for the tree line, my heart hammering like a drum. The RV was small, but in that moment, it felt like an ocean between me and those 2 maniacs. I didn't stop to look back. I just kept running. Eventually, I reached the ranger station, my feet bloody, my body trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. They found Russell and his friend later that night, hiding out near the campsite with a whole stash of stolen camping gear and weapons. Turns out they'd been robbing campers for months, using the park's seclusion to get away with it. In the end, Russell claimed he'd just been there by coincidence when the scarred guy attacked me. But the scarred man wasn't so lucky. After a short scuffle with the cops, he was arrested, with enough evidence of his outdoor exploits to keep him locked up for life. It turned out he had a habit of finding interesting campers to mess with, using the solitude of the park as his own twisted playground. That's what went down that night at Mount Rainier. And I still don't know what Russell's deal was, whether he was in on it from the start or just a bystander too afraid to stand up. But one thing's for sure, I'll never be borrowing an RV for scenery therapy again. The fog was thicker than I'd expected. I pulled my RV into a secluded clearing in Pisgah National Forest and stepped out into the damp air, the smell of wet earth heavy in my nose. Everything was muffled, as if the forest were holding its breath. The trees were shrouded in mist, their trunks fading into the gloom, and the trail I'd heard so much about was hidden somewhere out there, waiting for me. I'd come here to find something unique. My vlog had been stagnating, and I needed a fresh angle. A fellow hiker had mentioned an unmarked trail, a path that didn't appear on any maps. One locals swore disappeared and reappeared as if it had a life of its own. Perfect. If I could document it, film the mystery, my audience would eat it up. I grabbed my camera, set it up, and filmed a quick introduction. Hey everyone, it's Nate here, and I'm in the middle of the misty Pisgah National Forest, about to track down the infamous Vanishing Trail. Legend says this path comes and goes, and people who wander too far down it don't come back. Let's see if that's true. I packed up my gear and set off into the fog. The forest was silent, the only sound my boots crunching on damp leaves. I had a GPS in my pocket just in case, but I didn't plan to use it unless things got really bad. I wanted to go off the grid, find this mysterious trail, and see if there was anything to the rumors. I'd always been a skeptic. Ghost stories and folklore are fun to tell around a campfire, but not much else. As I walked, the fog thickened, swallowing the trees. It clung to my skin, cold and heavy. It wasn't long before I found the first strange marker, a stone slab jutting from the ground, its surface covered in spiraling symbols that didn't look like any language I knew. I filmed it, talking into the camera as I described the find. This looks like something from an old burial ground, but there's no mention of this on any maps. Really makes you wonder what else is out here, hidden beneath the fog. I kept moving. The trees closed in tighter, and the trail became fainter, more overgrown. Soon, it was little more than a game trail, barely wide enough to follow. I pushed forward, keeping the camera rolling, but after another hour of hiking, the trail simply disappeared. One moment, there had been a clear path. Now it was gone, swallowed by the forest. I checked my GPS, but the signal flickered weakly. The screen showed I was in the middle of nowhere. No path, no landmarks, just a blank screen with a blinking dot. Me. Alone. In the fog. "Okay," I muttered. "You've dealt with worse." I turned back the way I'd come, but the forest looked different now. The trees seemed closer together, the undergrowth denser. The fog was disorienting, and I had to rely on instinct to retrace my steps. The GPS was useless. I kept walking, scanning the ground for signs of the trail, but there was nothing. I was starting to feel uneasy. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. Not mine. I froze. The sound came from deeper in the forest, slow, deliberate footsteps crunching on the leaves. I turned, scanning the fog, but there was nothing, just the swirling mist. Then, out of the gloom, a figure emerged. An older man, his clothes tattered and damp, his eyes wide and vacant. "Hey," I called, my voice echoing through the stillness. "You lost too?" The man looked at me for a moment, then shuffled forward. He seemed off. His clothes were torn, his face pale, and there was a distant look in his eyes, like he wasn't entirely there. "I've been walking for days," he said, his voice hoarse. "The trail, it keeps changing." "Are you okay?" I asked, stepping toward him. He shook his head. "No one's okay out here." I frowned, feeling a cold knot of fear tighten in my stomach. "What do you mean?" "The trail, it moves. I've seen it, watched it disappear and reappear. It's not just a path, it's the forest. It doesn't want us to leave." I stared at him, my mind racing. This guy was either delirious or onto something. Either way, I didn't like the way he was talking. "Look, I have a GPS," I said, pulling it out. "We can find our way back." The man glanced at the GPS, then back at me. "It won't help. The forest is messing with it." I didn't believe him. I couldn't. I was a rational guy, and this was just a forest. I'd get us back to my RV, get this guy some help, and be done with it. But as we walked, things got stranger. The mist thickened, wrapping around the trees like a living thing. The forest seemed to shift with every step. What had been an open path a moment ago would be choked with brambles. When I looked back, trees seemed to loom closer, twisting into unfamiliar shapes. The man, whose name I learned was Eli, grew more agitated with every passing minute. "It's watching us," he muttered. "It knows we're here." "Who's watching?" I asked, growing impatient. "The forest," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "It's alive, and it's been here long before we were." I ignored him, focusing on the GPS, but even that was failing me. The screen flickered, the signal cutting in and out. At one point, it showed me standing on a clear path, but when I looked up, there was nothing but trees, thick, twisted trees that looked like they had grown there for centuries. We kept walking, the fog growing thicker, pressing in on us. The air felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the whispers started. Faint at first, like the wind through the leaves, but then more distinct voices calling out from the mist. "Nate," I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. "Did you hear that?" I asked Eli. He nodded, his eyes wide. "It's calling us." "The forest." I tried to shake it off, tell myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. The voice had spoken my name. We came across a backpack tangled in the branches of a tree, high above our heads. It was old, covered in dirt and torn, but when I climbed up to retrieve it, I found fresh supplies inside, water, food, like someone had packed it yesterday. I felt a chill run down my spine. How had it gotten there? Eli was growing more paranoid, his eyes darting around like he expected the trees to come alive at any moment. "We need to leave," he kept saying, "before it's too late." We pushed forward, but no matter which direction we went, we ended up back where we started. The fog seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The whispers grew louder. Then, without warning, Eli was gone. I turned around and he was just gone. The forest had swallowed him whole without a sound. I called out his name, but there was no response, only the dense mist pressing in on me. Panic set in. I was alone, lost in a forest that didn't want me to leave. The GPS was useless, and my camera was flickering, showing distorted footage of things I hadn't seen. Shadows moving in the trees, figures lurking just out of sight. I started running, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The trees twisted and shifted around me. The fog was so thick I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Every time I thought I'd found a way out, the forest closed in, trapping me in a maze of branches and brambles. The whispers were louder now, calling my name over and over. My camera caught glimpses of movement, dark figures moving through the mist, vanishing before I could focus on them. I didn't know what was real anymore. The forest seemed to warp around me, bending reality to its will. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the fog broke. I stumbled out of the trees and found myself back at my RV. The mist lingered at the edge of the forest, but it didn't follow. I didn't wait. I grabbed my keys, threw my gear into the RV, and drove, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I was miles away, the forest a distant memory in the rearview mirror. Back home, I reviewed the footage. I expected to see the horror I'd witnessed, the proof of the vanishing trail and the strange, shifting forest. But the videos showed nothing. The trail looked normal. The mist wasn't as thick, and Eli wasn't in the footage at all. It was like he'd never existed. I tried to tell myself it had been a bad trip, that my mind had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The forest had let me leave, but it hadn't forgotten me. And I had a feeling it was waiting somewhere in the mist for me to return. The forest around me was too quiet. I'd been sitting by the campfire outside my RV, immersed in the silence for hours, but now something felt off. The kind of off you feel in your gut before your brain catches up to what's happening. No wind, no rustling in the leaves, just dead stillness. That was the first thing I noticed when I pulled up to this remote campsite deep in Mount Hood National Forest. A place like this should have been full of life. Birds, insects, something. But the only sound was the crackle of the fire and the distant hum of the radio I'd brought along. I needed quiet after everything that had happened over the past year. I wasn't looking for distractions, just isolation. After my wife's death, nothing made sense anymore. People kept telling me I needed to move on, but the noise of life, the sympathy, the well-meaning advice, the friends who didn't know what to say, became unbearable. So I packed up and hit the road, hoping the wilderness would give me space to think, or maybe stop thinking altogether. I thought the forest would help. It had, until now. The radio's static broke the silence, a sudden burst of garbled noise that made me jump. I turned my head toward the RV, where the old ham radio sat inside. I hadn't even touched the thing in hours. It was an antique I'd brought along to mess around with in my downtime, but the signal had been dead all day. No stations, no chatter, nothing. Until now. I stood up from the fire, walked over to the RV, and ducked inside to check the radio. The static was louder, more insistent, like it was trying to form words but couldn't quite get there. I twisted the dials, searching for a clearer signal, but all I got was more white noise. Then, through the crackling, I heard it. A voice, faint and garbled, speaking numbers, 1, 3, 7, 8, 9. The numbers repeated over and over, mechanical and cold, like a voice from an old number station. It didn't make sense. I was miles from anywhere, and this was supposed to be a dead zone. No signal, no interference. The voice paused for a moment, then the numbers started again. 1, 3, 7. It sent a chill through me, but I told myself it was just some rogue signal bouncing off the atmosphere. maybe a military transmission. There were logical explanations for this kind of thing. I was sure of it. But the way the numbers repeated over and over felt wrong. Like the message wasn't for just anyone, it was for me. I shut the radio off. My fingers were trembling slightly. I wasn't here for this. I needed quiet, not some weird radio signal rattling around in my head. The next day, I tried to forget about the radio. I spent the morning hiking through the woods. The towering pines loomed overhead like silent giants. The air was cool and damp, the sky just a sliver of gray through the dense canopy. But something gnawed at me, a faint buzzing at the back of my mind. No birds, no animals, just silence. When I returned to the campsite, the radio was on again, static blaring from the speakers. I hadn't touched it. I stepped inside the RV, staring at the radio like it might come to life. The static was louder now, more intense. I could feel it in my bones, like the vibration from a low hum in the ground. And beneath the static, the numbers were back. 1, 3, 7, 8. I slammed my hand down on the off switch, killing the sound. My pulse was racing, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It had to be a glitch, something with the wiring, maybe a stray electrical signal. I'd worked with enough technology over the years to know that things sometimes did strange things when you weren't looking. But the numbers, the way they were so clear, so deliberate, I shook it off and stepped back outside, trying to push the growing unease away. That's when I noticed the man standing at the edge of my campsite. I hadn't heard him approach. He was just there, tall, scruffy, wearing a weathered jacket and a backpack slung over one shoulder. He looked like a camper, but there was something about the way he stood, stiff and tense, like he was waiting for something to happen. "Hey!" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "You lost?" The man looked at me, his face tight with anxiety. "I heard it too," he said. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Heard what?" "The signal, the numbers," he said, glancing toward the RV. "I've been picking it up on my own radio. It's not normal." My mouth went dry. "You've heard it too?" The man nodded. "I'm Ben," he said, stepping closer, his voice low. "I was camping a few miles down the road. I've been getting static, voices, weird electrical interference. My GPS stopped working. My cell phone drained to 0 in minutes." I swallowed hard, my mind racing. "What do you think it is?" Ben shook his head, his eyes darting toward the trees. "I don't know, but it's not natural. The way the signal moves, it's like it's getting closer." I didn't know how to respond to that. I was a man of logic, of science. Signals were signals. Glitches were glitches. But there was something about the way Ben spoke, the fear in his eyes, that made my skin crawl. That night, the radio came to life again. I tried to ignore it, tried to focus on the campfire and the peaceful silence of the woods, but the static was louder than before. The numbers were clearer, more insistent. 1, 3, 7, 8. Ben was sitting across from me, his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. His eyes constantly scanned the dark forest around us. He hadn't relaxed since he showed up, and I couldn't blame him. There was something wrong here, something I couldn't explain. "You think it's some kind of broadcast?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything. Ben shook his head. "I don't think it's a broadcast at all." "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then leaned closer, lowering his voice. "I think it's a warning, or a signal from something out there." I stared at him, trying to process what he was saying. A warning from what? Before I could ask, the static on the radio cut out for a moment. There was only silence, the kind of silence that presses down on you, that makes your skin prickle with anticipation. Then a sound, a soft rhythmic clicking, like something metallic tapping against wood. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the trees, but the beam only revealed darkness. The clicking grew louder, echoing through the forest. And then, through the radio, a voice crackled to life. "We see you." My blood ran cold. Ben's eyes widened, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" I whispered, my voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. The voice repeated, distorted and mechanical, "We see you." I stood up, the flashlight shaking in my hand. The clicking sound was closer now, coming from all around us, moving through the trees. The forest seemed to pulse with energy, the air growing thick and heavy, like the atmosphere itself was alive. "I think we should leave," Ben said, his voice tight with fear. For once, I agreed. The next morning, I found Ben's tent abandoned. His gear was scattered around the clearing, but there was no sign of him. No footprints, no note. Just the cold, empty forest and the low hum of static that had settled into the air like a living thing. I tried to follow his tracks, but they vanished in the thick underbrush. It was like he'd walked into the trees and disappeared. The GPS on my phone was useless, spinning me in circles. The battery drained faster than I'd ever seen. The static in my ears grew louder the further I went, like the signal was inside my head, vibrating through my skull. The numbers were back too, repeating over and over, etched into my mind. 1, 3, 7. By midday, I stumbled across something I hadn't expected. An old, dilapidated radio tower hidden deep in the woods. The metal was rusted, vines crawling up the sides, but it was still faintly humming with power. I climbed the tower, every step echoing in the stillness. My heart hammered in my chest. At the top, I found the source of the signal, a small glowing device pulsing with an eerie cold light. It didn't belong here. It wasn't part of the original tower. It was something else, something foreign. I reached out and touched it, and the static in my head exploded. The numbers, the clicking, the voices, it all crashed into me at once, an unbearable cacophony of sound. I stumbled back, nearly falling off the tower as the forest seemed to come alive around me. The lights returned, flickering in the trees, cold and mechanical. The clicking grew louder, more frantic, like something was chasing me. I ran. I don't remember how I made it back to the RV, but the lights followed me, the clicking never far behind. But I managed to get inside and slam the door shut. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the device still clutched in my hand. As I drove away, the static began to fade, but the numbers never left me. They echoed in my mind, a constant whisper, even as the forest disappeared in the rearview mirror. It's been days now, and I'm still hearing them. 1, 3, 7. I can't get them out of my head, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there, whatever sent that signal, knows where I am. And it's not done with me yet. It wasn't my first job, and it sure as hell wasn't supposed to be my last, but something about that night didn't sit right from the beginning. Maybe it was the silence on the dispatch call, or the way the wind howled across the San Rafael desert, as if it knew something I didn't. I should have listened to that instinct, the one that makes your gut twist and your hands clench the steering wheel tighter than usual. But when the money's right, sometimes you take a job you wouldn't otherwise. The rig hummed beneath me as I barreled down I-70, heading west. The sky was bruised with the last light of day, purple streaks fading into a storm building on the horizon. I had a long way to go and no time to waste. They said the cargo was sensitive. He needed to be kept at exactly 20 degrees, and if I messed up, there'd be hell to pay. That wasn't what bothered me, though. What bothered me was not knowing what the hell I was hauling. When they don't tell you what's in the trailer, it's never good. My name's Roy Mallister. Bones to the few truckers who still know me on the road. 45 years old, and I've spent the last 20 behind the wheel. The road used to be a kind of escape for me, a way to outrun the things I didn't want to face. But that was before Carol passed, before I let everything else fall apart, including my relationship with my daughter Emily. Haven't talked to her in years, and I don't think about it much anymore. I'm good at avoiding things like that. But tonight, something felt different. The desert stretched out endlessly on either side of me. Just red rock and dry air as far as the eye could see. I hadn't seen another car in miles, which was fine by me. The last thing I needed was distractions. That is, until the dashboard flashed red and the trailer's cooling unit flickered for the first time. I muttered a curse, pulling the rig over onto the shoulder. I cut the engine, grabbed my flashlight, and climbed out into the gathering dusk. The wind hit me hard, dust swirling around my boots as I made my way to the back of the trailer. I could hear the cooling unit working and stuttering like it was trying to fight off some kind of malfunction. Fumbling with the latch, I yanked open the back door and was greeted with a gust of frigid air. It smelled wrong in there, like cold metal and something decayed, the kind of smell that sticks in your nose and won't leave. I shined my light into the back, trying to figure out what was causing the problem. That's when I heard it. A soft tapping. No, not tapping. Scratching. It was coming from the crate, a large wooden crate strapped down in the center of the trailer, covered in heavy chains. My heart started to pound in my chest, the kind of adrenaline spike that tells you to get the hell out of there. But my feet wouldn't move. I inched closer, flashlight trembling in my grip. The scratching got louder. The crate shifted just slightly, as though something inside was alive. "What the hell?" I whispered, backing away. I wasn't going to open it. Not in a million years. I slammed the trailer door shut and locked it tight, forcing myself to breathe slowly. Whatever was in that crate, I wasn't sticking around to find out. I was just supposed to get it from point A to point B, no questions asked. I climbed back into the cab, started the engine, and pulled back onto the road, telling myself I was imagining things. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. Some government experiment or something. None of it mattered. All I had to do was deliver the damn thing. The radio crackled to life as I accelerated, and I jumped in my seat. Static. Then, through the fuzz, I heard something faint. A voice. A woman's voice. "Roy, why didn't you come back?" My heart stuttered. The voice sounded like Carol's. I smacked the side of the radio, trying to clear the signal, but the static only grew louder. The voice faded, replaced by an eerie, distorted country song, one I hadn't heard since she passed. It was one of her favorites. "No," I muttered, turning the radio off. This was just stress getting to me. The isolation, the weird cargo, and the fact that I hadn't slept in 2 days. That's all it was. That's what I told myself as I sped down that endless stretch of highway. But the farther I drove, the worse it got. The storm hit an hour later, and with it came the figures. I thought they were just shadows at first, shapes in the mist thrown up by the desert sandstorm. But as the wind howled and the sand lashed against the windshield, I could swear I saw them. People walking along the roadside. No, not people. Ghosts. Old men in trucker caps, women in long, flowing dresses, their faces pale and hollow, their eyes dark as the night. I gripped the wheel tighter, trying not to look. If I didn't look, they weren't real. That's how it works, right? I blinked hard, forcing my eyes back on the road, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, something, was watching me, following me. The trailer lurched hard, like something had slammed into the back of it. "What the hell?" I shouted, swerving the rig as I fought for control. My headlights cut through the dust, illuminating the desolate highway, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty miles. The trailer shook again, then came the knocking, loud, rhythmic, like someone was pounding on the inside of the crate. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I was done pretending it was nothing. I was done lying to myself. I had to stop. I had to see what was in that crate. I pulled the rig to the side of the road again, hands trembling as I jumped out of the cab. The wind whipped sand into my face, stinging my eyes, but I didn't care. I grabbed a crowbar from the toolbox and made my way to the back of the trailer. The knocking hadn't stopped. It was louder now, more urgent. With a deep breath, I unlocked the trailer and threw the doors open. The cold hit me again, but this time it wasn't just the refrigeration. There was something wrong about it. The air inside was thick, oppressive, like it was pressing down on me. I raised the crowbar, jammed it under the lid of the crate, and pried it open. And then everything stopped. The wind, the knocking, even the pounding of my own heart. Inside the crate, nestled in layers of straw and old cloth, was something small. It looked like a statue, a human skull, but blackened with strange symbols carved into the bone. It seemed to pulse, like it was alive, like it was breathing in time with me. And then the whispers started. Not from the radio this time, but from the skull itself. Voices swirling in my head, speaking in languages I couldn't understand. But one voice stood out, one voice I knew. Roy. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the skull began to glow with a faint, sickly light. The voices grew louder, and the wind picked up again, howling around the trailer. I slammed the crate shut and bolted the door. I didn't care what they said. I didn't care what I'd seen. I was getting the hell out of there. I threw the crowbar into the cab, jumped behind the wheel, and floored it. The trailer lurched behind me as I tore down the highway faster than I'd ever driven in my life. The storm whipped around me, and through the swirling dust, I could see them again. The figures. They were closer now, standing on either side of the road, their eyes following me. Some of them looked familiar. Faces I'd seen on the road before. Long-dead truckers, friends. Then, as if the storm itself parted, I saw her. Carol, standing in the middle of the road, her white dress flowing in the wind, her eyes locked on mine. I jerked the wheel, swerving to avoid her, but the rig skidded off the road. The trailer jackknifed as it skidded across the desert sand. I barely managed to hang on as the truck groaned to a stop, tilted sideways in a ditch. Silence. I sat there for a long time, staring out into the empty desert, trying to breathe. The storm passed, but I knew it wasn't over. I reached for my phone. No signal. No way out. And then, just as the last light faded from the sky, I saw her again. Carol, walking slowly toward me. Her face pale and cold, her eyes filled with something I couldn't understand. "Roy," she whispered, her voice soft but clear in the stillness. "It's time to come home." I didn't run. I didn't scream. I just sat there, waiting as the darkness closed in around me. I didn't believe in ghosts, UFOs, or anything supernatural. I spent most of my career chasing down so-called paranormal phenomena and explaining them with cold, hard facts. That was my job, turning superstition into science, myths into measurable data. The Brown Mountain Lights? They were just another mystery waiting for a rational explanation. That's what I told myself as I drove my RV up the winding roads of Pisgah National Forest. The thick trees closed in on either side. The air was crisp, and autumn leaves scattered across the path. There was a quiet stillness that made the world feel far away. I should have felt calm, excited even. But as the sun began to sink behind the distant ridges, leaving the forest bathed in shadow, I felt something else. Tension. Shaking it off, I parked the RV at the remote campsite I'd scouted. This was supposed to be a solo trip, a few days to get up close and personal with the Brown Mountain Lights, interview locals, take readings, and prove once and for all that the lights were nothing more than atmospheric conditions or optical illusions. I had all the gear I'd need: high-resolution cameras, thermal scanners, EMF detectors, the works. I wasn't expecting to find anything supernatural, just an anomaly. And anomalies had explanations. But the moment I stepped out of the RV, a chill ran through me. The trees rustled softly, as if whispering some secret I wasn't meant to hear. "Focus," I muttered to myself, dragging my gear out and setting up the cameras, angling them toward Brown Mountain Ridge. I had a perfect view of the ridge from my campsite, miles away, but clear in the distance. That's where the lights were supposed to appear. By the time I was fully settled in, I was sitting outside the RV, bundled in a jacket, sipping coffee, and staring out into the dark, waiting. The forest was eerily silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just stillness. Then, around midnight, I saw them. At first, they were faint, flickering, small orbs of light hovering just above the ridge. I squinted, adjusting the focus on my binoculars. There they were. Three lights bobbing in the air like they were floating on an invisible current. I grabbed my camera, flipping the switch to start recording, but nothing happened. The lens stayed black. The screen dead. "What the hell?" I muttered, fiddling with the buttons. Fully charged and brand new, the camera shouldn't have malfunctioned. I checked the battery, clicked it back into place, and tried again. Still nothing. Frustration surged through me. This was exactly what I'd come here for. The lights, right there in front of me, and I couldn't even capture them. I stood up, grabbing my thermal scanner, but when I flipped it on, the screen flickered, then went dark. "Come on," I whispered, trying to stay calm. The gear wasn't cheap, and none of it should have been failing, but it was, piece by piece. The lights danced on the ridge, growing brighter, closer. My heart raced. I wasn't scared, I told myself. I was just annoyed. The logical part of my brain struggled to make sense of it. Maybe the electronics were glitching because of interference. Some kind of electromagnetic field or something. I took a deep breath, trying to settle my nerves. But the lights, those strange pulsing orbs, kept moving, almost as if they were drifting toward me. The air turned cold, so cold that I could see my breath misting in front of my face. A thin layer of frost started forming on the ground, on the RV windows, on my gear. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, my hands beginning to stiffen in the chill. It didn't make sense. The weather forecast had called for a cool night, but nothing like this. I checked my phone's temperature app. 30 degrees-y? Impossible. I glanced at my surroundings, feeling the silence close in around me. Then I noticed the lights were no longer on the ridge. They were much closer now, floating just above the treetops, flickering like distant fireflies, but larger. Too large.